Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If you join us from the UK or Europe, hello to everybody else online from all those different time zones that we have come to, so accustomed to manage. My name is Ulrich Pagel. I'm the chair of the Center for Yoga Studies here at SOAS, and it gives me very great pleasure to be able to welcome you today to today's book launch with discussion. This is our last event in the current season of seminars, lectures, book launches, and the like of the Center of Yoga Studies. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us also today with the summer truly upon us. Today we have the great honor to be launching and discussing the book of Professor Karl Bouthillette, who joins us from Manipal University in India. Professor Bouthillette has long worked on yoga studies and doxography in particular. He obtained his PhD from the University of Munich, and there are many things that are really special about his work and for its use of lists. And as a Buddhist studies scholar, of course, I recognize the importance of lists and list making in the religious literature of the Buddhist tradition and beyond. But Professor Bouthilette's work reaches well beyond a single tradition. He examines Hindu, Buddhist, as well as Jaina materials. And in today's class, in today's book launch, he will be examining a study, discussing a study in which he applies doxography to jñāna yoga, or yoga of knowledge. And in many ways, his work is truly groundbreaking, and I look very much forward to be learning more about this publication. The discussants today will be Mikel Burley and Jason Birch, who of course are well known for their contributions to yoga studies. Without further ado, I would like now to hand over the proceedings to our esteemed guests. With that in mind, I'd like to hand over the microphone to Mickey and Jason for an introduction of the book and perhaps a few more words about the background of the speaker himself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ulrich, and many thanks to Jackie and other colleagues at SOAS for organising this event. And many thanks to Karl for authoring the book that we're discussing. I should say at the outset that I very much enjoyed reading it, and any critical remarks that I make in this talk are in the spirit of stimulating reflection on the issues that the book raises, and it certainly raises a lot of interesting issues. Well, since I'm the first to be speaking on this panel, I should start with a general overview of the book. And then I'll offer some comments on aspects of it that I found particularly interesting or puzzling or otherwise notable. The book, entitled Metaphysics as Therapy, List Making and Renunciation in Gnostic Yogas, is a remarkable achievement. It's a substantial work of interdisciplinary comparative analysis that engages with sources from South Asian philosophies, Western philosophies, religious studies, sociology, cultural anthropology, cognitive psychology, and various other disciplines. The main title, Metaphysics as Philosophy, expresses Karl's view that the respective metaphysical systems articulated by various philosophers or philosophical schools of South Asia are best understood as serving a practical purpose. The purpose can be termed therapeutic, inasmuch as it involves the alleviation of the distress or suffering that, according to the philosophies at issue, results from our ordinary states of attachment and emotional investment in the world. The book's subtitle, List Making and Renunciation in Gnostic Yogas, refers to both the constructive and the deconstructive aspects of the therapeutic process. On the constructive side, Karl observes that the metaphysical systems developed by many South Asian philosophies take the form of lists. lists of the constituents of reality, or the constituents of our experience of reality, or indeed the constituents of the beings that we ordinarily take ourselves to be. On the deconstructive side, the relinquishing of attachment to the world takes the form of renouncing the various items that constitute the lists. To follow the philosophical texts that Karl discusses is ultimately to abandon one's ordinary sense of identity, recognizing that one is not this body or this mind or this series of sensory experiences and so on. To characterize the type of therapeutic philosophies that he's interested in, Karl uses the term Gnostic Yogas, since they're forms of yogic discipline designed to cultivate knowledge or gnosis. To use the relevant Sanskrit term, which Ulrich mentioned, they're forms of jñāna or jñāna yoga. The book amounts to over 300 pages, and the final third comprises case studies of 4 South Asian philosophical texts, which Karl expounds in ways that illustrate his overall interpretive approach. The 4 texts are the Sāṃkhyakārikā of Īśvarakṛṣṇa, Gauḍapāda's Advaita commentary on the Mandukya Upanishad, the Heart Sūtra of Mahayana Buddhism, and the Bharasa Anuveka, or 12 Contemplations, attributed to the Jaina Digambara monk Kundakunda. Now I'll make some comments on methodological issues that the book touches on. Karl explicitly contrasts his own hermeneutic approach to what's commonly referred to as philology. Jason knows far more about what philology involves than I do, but in brief, it concerns the close reading of textual sources, aiming to discover their relation to other texts, especially earlier texts that have been incorporated in whole or in part into the later ones, scrutinizing discrepancies between different manuscripts of the same text, seeking to recover an original version of the text, and so on. Karl's approach, by contrast, is to foreground the practical, therapeutic, or soteriological functions of the text. As he puts it on page 187, quote, I am concerned with the practical application of the texts and not merely with their linguistic and doctrinal explanation. Karl's methods for getting at this practical or therapeutic or liberation-oriented function include some comparative analysis, both across different South Asian traditions and between South Asian and Western philosophies. For example, Karl invokes the phrase philosophy as a way of life and the notion of a philosophy as a series of spiritual exercises from the 20th century French philosopher Pierre Hadot, who had applied it primarily in his work on ancient Greek and Roman philosophies. Although Karl isn't the first to do so, he brings out the relevance of this conception of philosophy to the South Asian context. Also central to his approach is the notion of sacrificial ritual, the paradigm of which is the Vedic fire sacrifice, as a model or analogy for what's going on in therapeutic philosophy. In brief, Karl's idea is that the fire sacrifice, the ritual fires, in the fire sacrifice, the ritual fires are first constructed out of bricks as a kind of model or homologue of the cosmos as a whole. And after the ritual's been enacted, the whole construction is burnt to the ground as a kind of renunciation or figurative dissolution of the cosmos. By analogy, therapeutic philosophy or Gnostic yoga involves building up an intellectual model of the world or of oneself, or both, for this model to ultimately be abandoned in the act of self-renunciation. Karl follows previous interpreters in describing this process as the internalization of the ritual sacrifice. But he adds usefully that it would be misleading to think of the original Vedic fire sacrifice as merely external, as though it wasn't also designed to have transformative implications for those who perform it. I have a few questions for Karl about his methodology, which I may as well mention at this point. My main question concerns the purpose of the exposition and analysis of the philosophies that you discuss, Karl. Throughout my reading of most of the book, I assumed that your objective was largely hermeneutical or exegetical, In other words, I assumed you were aiming to provide a credible interpretation of the South Asian philosophies. What I had not assumed was that you were trying to go further than this and to inspire your readers to become Gnostic yogis themselves and to transform their own self-understanding, leading eventually to world renunciation. But in the concluding chapter, you imply that you are indeed trying to prosecute this more ambitious objective. You say, for example, that the book has attempted to illustrate, quote, how South Asian Gnostic sacrificial and philosophical speculation, in dialogue with multidisciplinary scholarship, may challenge some of our worldviews and open our minds to a whole new dimension of freedom and power, to a renewed practice of spirituality. And you outline two versions of a pedagogical strategy for apparently encouraging this transformative spiritual practice in your readers. My question on this point then is that of how you're expecting or hoping your readers will respond to the book. Are you hoping simply that they'll come away with a deeper understanding of the South Asian philosophies, including the soteriological context of those philosophies? Or are you hoping also to convert your readers to the path of world renunciation? A second question I have has to do with the analogy of a fire sacrifice. In the chapter on the Sāṃkhyakārikā, for instance, you invite your readers to, quote, imagine that the Sāṃkhyakārikā is an inner ritual modelled on the classic performance of external sacrifice. You present this imagining as a heuristic thought experiment. But this left me wondering what status you're attaching to the imagined scenario. Are you proposing that if we think of the Sāṃkhyakārikā as an inner ritual, then we may see an aspect of the text that would otherwise be missed? Or are you making the stronger claim that the Sāṃkhyakārikā is in fact an inner ritual modelled on the Vedic fire sacrifice? Now I have a comment on the relation between therapy and truth. One of the book's themes that struck me as especially interesting has to do with this relation, or we might say the relation between the making of truth claims and the pursuit of a therapeutic or soteriological goal. You challenge the view that to be acceptable as genuine or proper philosophy, a system of thought must, as it were, be rationally defensible, independently of any spiritual, religious, or therapeutic aspirations with which it may have traditionally been associated. At one point, you quote Mark Sideritz, who affirms that, quote, Buddhist thinkers engage in serious and sustained efforts to work out what most fundamentally exists, and that the fact that their projects arose in a soteriological context should not stand in the way of their efforts being understood as genuinely philosophical. And that's Sideritz quoted on page 250 of your book. And as you rightly note, Karl, a lot of assumptions are packed into this term genuinely philosophical, as though philosophy were to be thought of as, by definition, a purely intellectual or abstract activity, uncontaminated by practical spiritual concerns. As you also note, if we were to accept such a conception of philosophy, we might have to exclude a good deal from the Western philosophical canon, going at least as far back as Socrates, given that there's good reason to think that Socrates regarded philosophy as an activity of self-transformation. I wondered, though, how far you wanted to go in arguing for a more intimate connection between philosophy and practical concerns. If we look at a philosopher such as Wittgenstein, for example, who's a paradigmatic case of a philosopher whose work has been characterized as therapeutic, his approach is regarded as therapeutic precisely because it does not seek to construct any metaphysical system. On the contrary, what Wittgenstein typically aims to do is to disclose confusions about our use of language, which tend to lead us down the path of generating philosophical pseudo-problems. In the case of a South Asian philosophy such as that of the Sāṃkhyakārikā, however, there does appear to be a deliberate attempt to construct a coherent metaphysical system, an account of the way things are. So even if, as the Sāṃkhyakārikā explicitly announces, the motivation for the philosophy is therapeutic or soteriological, it doesn't follow that the author of the text is not in the business of making truth claims about how things really are. At certain places, it seemed as though you wanted to treat the South Asian philosophies as not making truth claims, but as developing a purely provisional conceptual framework which would then be systematically dismantled through the process of renunciation. So, if there's time, it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on this matter, but of course, I'm aware that there won't be time to discuss everything. Now, I'm not sure about how much more time I've got. I mean, I've got another point that I could raise now, or I could leave it to further discussion. Is anyone available? Jackie, available to comment on the timekeeping?
Yes, you're welcome to keep going if you like.
Yeah, just another point. It would probably only take a couple of minutes. It was just a few words on the theme of list making. As indicated in its subtitle, a key theme of the book is the making of lists in South Asian philosophies and in other traditions as well. I particularly enjoyed the passage that you quote, Karl, from Jose Cabazon on pages 45 to 46, which reads in part, quote, "Buddhists love lists. Enlightenment may be of one flavor, but that doesn't stop Buddhists from claiming that there are 2 truths, 3 jewels, 4 immeasurables, 5 paths, 6 perfections, and 7 factors to enlightenment. Noble path, as we all know, is 8-fold. There are 22 sanghas, 37 aids to enlightenment, 84,000 portions of the doctrine, and of course, the lists of lists goes on." That's the end of the quote from Cabazon. You characterize South Asian metaphysical constructions in terms of list making of various kinds, lists of categories or sequences of activities or taxonomies of entities. And you characterize the goal to be achieved in terms of the negation of lists. So a question that occurs to me in this connection is whether the accentuation of list making in giving an account of South Asian philosophies risks painting an unduly reductive picture. For instance, to take the Sāṃkhya philosophy as an example again, the series of tattvas that constitute the Sāṃkhya metaphysical system can indeed be laid out in the form of a list, but to leave it at that would miss out the relations of conditionality or dependence that obtain between the various tattvas. Thus, for example, there's a reason why the Sāṃkhyakārikā states that buddhi gives rise to ahankara, which in turn gives rise to manas and the 5 sense capacities, 5 action capacities, and so on. Exactly what the reason is a tricky interpretive matter, but it seems clear that there is a reason. The ordering of the tattvas is not merely arbitrary. So, because of this, I wonder whether describing the series of tattvas as a list really does justice to the internal complexity of the system and of the interrelations between the tattvas. And there are inevitably other issues that could be raised, but for reasons of time, I think I should leave it there for now. Many thanks.
So, well, thank you so much for first the introduction, the broad summary. I think, I mean, there will be a lot to answer, and I took notes, at least I have 4 main questions that you raised. I think you already gave a good portrait. I thought perhaps I mean, should I respond immediately or we move with Jason? I think we had suggested we move on with Jason, and then I kind of conclude and try to answer to both of you. Is that shall we keep with that plan? That's
yes. Go ahead. That's a good idea, Karl. So we'll go to Jason now, and okay. Jason, you can hear his response, and then we'll open the discussion. Thank you.
Great.
Okay. Well, thanks, Karl, for the invitation to comment on your book, Metaphysics is Therapy, and thanks also, Mick, for providing an overview of the book that saves me some trouble. I thought the book was well written and gives a fresh perspective on several renowned philosophical works of India's classical period. In responding publicly to the book, I feel obliged to say that I'm not the best person to be assessing it, because my area of research focuses on yoga traditions of the 2nd millennium, whereas Karl focuses on philosophical and religious traditions of the 1st. So rather than respond directly to the primary sources that Karl studies, I'll respond to some of his ideas by citing primary sources that I know more intimately, in the hope that it may extend and test some of Karl's ideas beyond the literature examined in his book. Although Karl's book does not address the material I research, I'm certainly glad to have read it. Anyone who reads Sanskrit primary sources would be aware that they contain and are sometimes structured as a series of lists. The standard explanation for this in Indology is that the list-making attributes of Sanskrit literature derive from a culture in which texts and teachings were memorized. In a masterfully written chapter at the beginning of the book, Karl examines a multitude of biological, neurological, linguistic, social, and historical factors that underlie the construction of lists, series, categories, and taxonomies. Reading this chapter is like putting on a pair of coloured glasses that one cannot take off. Whatever humans have made then appears as just a series of lists, because, as Karl argues, taxonomical practices are inherent to structured thinking. The beauty of the book, however, is that Karl's obsession with list-making leads him to reflect deeply on the final goal of South Asian religions and philosophies. That is, the realization of the ultimate state of being, free from suffering and delusion. As Karl notes, this higher reality transcends the world that can be conceptualized through list-making. In Indian traditions, this reality is referred to by such names as Kaivalya, Nirvana, Moksha, and so on. Karl argues that the ultimate reality sought by Gnostics is achieved by two main processes. The first is determinate negation, such as the practice of contemplating that the highest reality is not this and not that, known in the Upanishads as neti neti. And the second is renunciation, both to the external world and the internal world of preconceived beliefs, worldviews, doctrines, and the like. To demonstrate this, as Mick said, Karl focuses on the principal philosophical works of Sāṃkhya, Madhyamaka Buddhism, early Advaita Vedanta, and Jainism. Karl attempts to identify the salient features of gnosis in these South Asian philosophies and proposes a clear hypothesis on the chronological development of Gnosticism as it emerged from speculation on ritual practices. As Karl would know from some of our previous conversations, what I find cumbersome and perhaps unnecessary in his discussion of Gnosticism is the use of the term yoga in such phrases as Gnostic Yoga or yogic Gnosticism. In Karl's universalizing scheme, the Gnostic elements of these different philosophies constitute a yoga, which he designates as jñāna yoga, because they require a path, a method, and a lifestyle. In my mind, the problem with this is that each of the philosophical traditions in question treats yoga more specifically, and in the case of Īśvarakṛṣṇa's Sāṃkhyakārikā, not at all. Also, as Karl notes in the section on renouncing yoga, Gnostics tend to reject yoga as a soteriological practice through their determinate negation. So I personally think the word gnosis would have been sufficient and less problematic for discussing philosophical and religious traditions of the first millennium. As a category in lists of yoga, of different yogas, the term jñāna yoga appears only in the early modern period, with the exception of a few Puranas and commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita. Viewing gnosis through the lens of my research makes me also question the pervasive role of internal renunciation that Karl sees in his sources. Did this change within tantric traditions, where a more life-affirming vision of liberation in life, jivan mukti, emerged? A good point of reference here is the Yoga Bija, a yoga text that defends the need for practicing yoga in light of the Gnostic view that knowledge alone is enough for liberation. Shiva argues that the defects that bind us to samsara are material in nature, and knowledge is unable to remove them, just like knowledge alone will not remove an annoying ant crawling on one's body. The practice of yoga, Shiva argues, removes psychophysical faults and in fact purifies the body by burning up its gross elements, thus rendering it ageless, free of disease, immortal, and liberated. In this process, liberating gnosis is acquired through the practice of yoga, and the yogi continues to live in the world with all supernatural powers like a god. I suspect that the aims of bodily immortality and living in the world with supernatural powers was a reaction to the higher renunciation that Karl sees as central to Gnostic yoga. Renouncing worldly conceptions or doctrinal views is not an issue in Hatha and Raja Yoga texts. No doctrine is taught, only a practice. The conventional and ultimate levels of truth or reality that characterize the Gnostic schemes examined by Karl are not taught in these ancillary yoga systems. And although the neophyte yogi might have to adopt worldly renunciation during the practice, some yogis were under the impression that they could live like kings after liberation. In short, some conceptions of Jivan Mukti are more about living in the world with power rather than renouncing it. And perhaps I can finish with a tentative idea that challenges Karl's thesis that a jnana yogi must internalize a worldview, often encapsulated by a series of lists, so that they can then dismantle it through dialectical negation to achieve liberation from samsara. Karl's thesis certainly offers valuable insight into the workings of the philosophical traditions that he gravitated to in his book. However, a broad view of the history of yoga and the practices encapsulated by Patanjali's Ashtanga system, which took on a life of their own after the Patanjali Yogaśāstra, make me wonder whether the practice of yoga can lead to gnosis without the framework of any particular philosophical or religious doctrine. This is probably more apparent in Hatha and Raja Yoga traditions, which were ancillary systems intended for people of various religious traditions. The metaphysical and doctrinal elements in their teachings serve only to explain how and why the practices work, but the practice itself requires only a smattering of such knowledge. In the case of Hatha Yoga, the three main nadis and how prana and apana function. Similar examples can be found in tantric Kala systems of yoga, such as those of the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra and the Svabodhaya Manjari. It seems to me that these yogas were intended to achieve a realization of the ultimate truth without a systematic training in a conventional reality, in much the same way that a liberated yogi is supposed to attain knowledge of all shastras without having studied any of them. A consideration of these types of systems is absent in Karl's book. I doubt whether the practitioner of Patanjali Yoga was required to undertake rigorous contemplation of a conventional reality that might amount to a dialectical negation. The process of the tattvas imploding into alinga matra through the practice of samapati is described in Sutras 149 to 51. But is this really comparable to the practice of determinate negation in Vedanta, that is neti-neti, or seeing the emptiness of all dharmas in Abhidharma Buddhism? Or does it merely describe how the Nirodha state occurs through meditation? And is it really similar to the dialectical and taxonomical reflection espoused by Sāṃkhya? All in all, I find the similarities Karl identifies between different traditions often raises more questions for me than it answers. And perhaps yogic Gnosticism is different to philosophical Gnosticism. If we separate the words jnana and yoga for a minute, as Shankara does in his interpretation of jnana yoga in the Bhagavad Gita, could it be the case that determinate negation was a feature of some Gnostic traditions of India, but was not a salient practice for yoga traditions? Without Karl's book, I probably would not be asking these questions, so I congratulate him on a thought-provoking piece of scholarship. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason. I think even perhaps if you had doubted, your own from your own background, why necessarily I wanted to have you on the panel, I think you've shown why. I think it's very relevant, and I think I will proceed with the same order that we began. So I will go with Michael's kind of main points, and I I will, within the short amount of time we have, also try to cover yours, Jason. But first, thank you so much for the very genuine engagement with the work and answering. It took a bit of time, and I think the book is a bit of a mental, exercise in itself. That as well perhaps goes with one of Mikel's observations. Do I really think people are going to become Gnostic by reading this? At least I don't know, but they would have engaged in some kind of Gnostic exercise just by reading the book in some kind of way. So I will go with the points raised, and I hope to be able to cover those all the points, because they're all very meaningful. And I was hoping that Jason would help to also somehow extend the book to what I didn't cover. So to me, you've highlighted somehow kind of the conversations that could be interesting for people in the yoga studies, even though there is this constant idea, I feel, perhaps it's just me in my own isolation, but I sometimes feel there is a fear or a thinking that the darshanas and so forth have little to do actually with the yoga. And this is something that I wanted the book to challenge, or at least to provoke. And from your answer, I have the impression that at least a provocation was received. So that is something I'm happy with. Now, to come with Mikel again, thank you so much. I've said thank you enough, but I'll go with your first question. So what do I expect in terms of outcome, towards the conclusion only, right? I just do that in the conclusion last chapter, if you want. I try to get out of my purely subjective, purely academic, if you want, expected role, and wonder what, today people are, engaging in yoga studios, are engaging in all different kinds of practice, and there is even movement that is called practical philosophy and so forth, in which I also intervened to some degree, and I was wondering, well, if people like this read this book, they might wonder, how to go about it. And so I wanted to have at least some kind of an idea or a reflection on it, and I proposed there, two kind of pedagogical way. One I call total enculturation, so you become kind of a yogi by going on the spot and learning, the culture, the language, the text, and which takes an enormous amount of time. And then second method I suggest more is to engage with one's own list, right? One's own conception, and start from there. And that is nice. That is your first question, because I think it relates a little bit with what Jason was mentioning. So some yogis are suggesting we don't need perhaps to do all of this, learning all the shastras and so forth. And I think some of the agnostic will argue, and they will have, they would agree, and they would have an argument, which I think I've put forward there, is that perhaps you don't need to engage with the list of the shastras, but at one point or another, you will have to engage with your own list, with your own mental representation of reality, whatever that is. The shastras help, at least that's what is suggested by the text, they help bring forth the cosmos, right? So they propose a map, so that this map can be used as a mirror. I call it a palliative within the text, so that one is given guidance somehow to be able to see how the world is fabricated within one's mind. And I believe that's another question that Mikel had. I believe that those who wrote these texts actually believed that map was good. So if the Sāṃkhyakārikā laid out a map that thought was a very helpful map. However, this being said, ultimately the map is to be abandoned, not to be taken for the territory itself. And that is, like, if you want, the end, right? The result, when the map has been traversed, the territory becomes. Now, I think this is quite an important point, because I think it's a relation, it makes a binding with later Tantra and later Yoga. It is one thing to say we don't need text and so forth, but at one point a yogi will have to engage with mind. And the mind has certain function it represents, and these representations have to be dealt with. And if one hasn't been trained at all on how to engage with that, I don't really see how breathing and gymnastics, if you want to put it that way, and some devotion could do the exact work that philosophy does. That's personal. Perhaps I just don't know enough about the later texts and Tantra. I think Tantras are much more complex, actually, than what I just depicted, right? But that's just an approach. What do I expect of people, of the book? Well, I expect first people learning a little bit about a very rich, multi-traditional, if you want, kind of practice, and that's why I've termed it yoga. All right, that's if you want, involved with philosophy towards a certain form of transformation, so which I call therapeutic, and that's if some people are interested in, if you want to do it for themselves, which why not? Then they can find guidance there, seeing that it has been done in the past. But yeah, it's not for me to do it. But I wanted to have a thought on this and not just produce the kind of work that pretends that our scholarship and the texts we live are just in the past or are purely theoretical. I wanted to reflect on the fact that we perhaps may want to or be interested in this kind of thing. So your second question I have on aspects that, let me just read my note. The inner sacrifice, or the text is an inner sacrifice or an aspect, perhaps. I think in my note I was too fast here. I'm not sure if I understand, if I remember fully about this, but I know that both of you have had some kind of reflection on why I go with the inner work there, working on pretty old theories, actually, right? I mean, this has been somehow done. I try to do it anew, and I think in my work I try to show that at some point the inner and outer distinction breaks. But that's working, if you want, with that frame allows us to see a continuity with the theorization of sacrifice, Vedic sacrifice kind of theoretical framework, how it continues through the philosophical text or in the darshana. And in my view, through what I call jnana yoga, there is a continuity through to Tantra. What I've seen often is that there is theorization of the internalization of sacrifice from Vedic to Tantric time, and there is a big gap in between. And I'm trying to suggest part of that gap actually is darshana. Is the text and the engagement with philosophy that has a kind of an approach to art to very practically through, but for me practically means intellectual internalization to contemplation, to meditation. One can mimicate the actions of sacrifice somehow. I'm going fast because it's just 10 minutes, but a third point, so we might want to come back on this if I, misrepresent or the questions. So how far are you willing to go with the therapeutic model? That's how I kind of framed it, because, well, yes, they are, from Wittgenstein, there are others who went with, I think, Wittgenstein's idea of is almost abandoning philosophy in the end, which I find a late echo of certain texts that I talked about. So what I want to say here is that somehow, although in Wittgenstein there is an abandonment of metaphysics, and it's something that is, I think, is marking modern philosophy or post-Kant, late after Kant. So contemporary philosophy tends to have some kind of a disdain with metaphysics, and I try to, now the whole thing is about epistemology, if you want. So epistemology is the art forge, it's analytical, it's linguistic based. And I want to, here in the book, I want to emphasize the importance of metaphysics, if only for one thing, for offering a map. Metaphysics is mapping the world, but that world is not just the world out there. So we might disagree, let's say, with Aristotle or Kant, the precisions of the category and so forth. And what I'm suggesting, perhaps a little bit kind of with the Wittgenstein, critique and so forth. So perhaps the absolute truth of that map doesn't matter so much, so long as it offers a kind of reflection to one's, some self-discovery. So one learns to think when one learns metaphysics. One learns to what it is to be a substance and not a quality or not action. And by distinguishing the relation within all these categories, one slowly learns to actually properly about thinking itself. And until one does that, there is no possibility of the therapeutic work that I'm talking about in that book. Somehow the very process of thinking has to be seen, and in order to do that, you need to be looking at, into something. To go straight into epistemology, I find is unhelpful, at least for a big amount of most people who haven't been trained at all. So metaphysics offers a training ground. And in that sense, I think it's rich to go back to this tradition, to keep the map as a map, knowing that perhaps these people, in the text I talk about Sāṃkhyakārikā, right? So I think for these people, when they laid out a map, their map is the best map, it's the best view. Otherwise they wouldn't defend it, right? But somehow the map is not the territory, because somehow, if you want, the Veda itself is not Brahman, or Purusha is not the Sāṃkhyakārikā. But if you want to see Purusha, Sāṃkhyakārikā offers you a very skillful map. So that's a bit of my answer to that. And then I found that this fourth question of yours very interesting, is the idea of list reductionists. I think that, with the rich chapter that I put, because I put a lot of time on that, and it's perhaps where I've learned the most. I really appreciate it, writing and reading all this cognitive theories in psychology and so forth around list making. And I think the notion of list is much more rich than what it appears. So to me, the notion of list is not a reduction. Actually, it kind of echoes world, it echoes the world in kind of Umberto Eco. It's a seed of culture. And also to come back in the Karika, I think I insist also that it's not just a list, but it's a poetic list. We have a full drama that unfolds around the list, and I try in my reading to bring out the richness of the poetry around the list. Once we remove the poetry, though, we are stuck with the list. But the list itself talks about the human mind. It talks about how we construct reality. And I don't think that I have reduced the listing as a very simple thing. I think I've shown just how complex it is. So to me, it's not reductionistic. But I understand what you're trying to say. I do hope, again, to come back, that particularly with the Sāṃkhyakārikā, and I think perhaps a bit more also with the Heart Sūtra, that I've shown us how poetic these lists can be, in different ways. So that's for, my reply to Mikel. Now, Jason, obviously, and I hope we will have this conversation more, around the use of yoga. I'm still not ready to let it go. Somehow for one reason, I would be honest, perhaps it's marketing. All right. I will say it that way, that actually I want people who are interested in yoga to consider philosophy as yoga, and to consider that yoga as it is today developed out of also some forms of philosophical reasoning. And that I do not agree with you that the jnana yoga term comes so much late, as you put it, because through my search into it, it comes pretty, early at the time where I would say it's convenient, at least in Jainism. And in some, all right, perhaps Madhva is a bit late, but Ramanuja is not too late. And then I think if we look at Prajna Paramita and so forth, and they sometimes themselves, these authored Madhyamikas, refer to themselves as yogins, and they do what they do, Madhyamika. And in that sense, perhaps the word is not exactly the same thing, but so I do find, a relevance in using the word yoga, if only to draw a certain attention. But also, I think there is historical resonance. And there is a sense that even though the yoga as a school is renounced and yoga as a practice is renounced, just like philosophy is renounced and the Veda is renounced, but if Shankara renounced eventually even the Upanishad, let's say, he still cherishes it, and that is where it's very interesting the dialectic with. In a Hegel sense, what is being negated is actually being purified, not particularly abandoned. So the rejection in that context is actually an act of purification. It's making it better. So when I see this is where I argue, when there is a rejection of yoga in some of these texts, they are actually purifying it in the sense of which they see it best. So yoga will be best understood that way. That is not a total negation of it, but here an Aufheben, kind of a determinate, as I say, negation from Hegel. Yeah, that's the way I wanted to answer with that. And then the idea of the internal renunciation or external renunciation or internal practice or external practice, I find, and that is why also I wanted to have you here, Jason, because this is where I feel that we get into a very rich, multi-layered interaction for centuries of speculation about what it is to actually practice. And I think we don't have enough scholarship on that, actually. I think there is a tendency in modern yoga studies to really focus on practice as something that is performative, as in what I would call in Sanskrit term, karma kri, right? If you do something, and we have a rich tradition just a bit before that, the one I'm interested in, that sees its own, if its own practice or its own contemplation as going against the grain of karma. And I think I've put in this, in the second chapter of the book, I tried to say that in my view, there is a constant back and forth in Indian history, in Indian philosophical history, leading, from the early, if you want, Agamas to later Hatha Yoga, Tantra, and so forth. There's a constant back and forth in what it is actually. And even at the time where there would be what I call the Gnostics, there would also be others who are a bit more interested in, the external practice, external acts of devotion, external ritual, external sacrifice. So it's not that when there was one, the others were not there. I think there is, and more than just the context of South Asia, I think this particular question is rich and potent today as well. To better understand renunciation, is the renunciation of the yogins I'm talking about, although it negates so much and is so intellectual and so abstract and talks about a Brahman, that the Brahman or a nirvana that is beyond all conception, is really, really disembodied. I'm trying to if you want, challenge that a little bit. The reflection, the practice is allowing for abstract thought, for samadhi, and cessation of a lot of things, but the production of that is still in the world, and I think it cares for a world. And I think in the same way that I was talking about the negation, for example, of yoga as not just total denial, but as purification, I think we have to understand the Gnostic, and that is also, I would say, to me, this is my reply to Nietzsche, all right? So I go beyond our discussion, but when Nietzsche, if you want, spit on ascetic practices and so forth as purely world negating, I would like to remind him, of his tutors and people just a bit before him about negation here is not just total negation, it's purification. So a world that we negate is a world in which we make better by removing what is false within it. So that would be a kind of a part of an answer to your second question. And then you third was, I already answered a little bit, but what about, if you want yoga without the framework of renunciation, or without the contemplative layers, or what about somebody, reaching contemplative state without studying agamas and so forth? Obviously, I am no one to say it's impossible. How would I know? It's just completely beyond me. But here again, as I was mentioning, and I think toward the conclusion, I try to develop that a little bit, reflecting on what it would be in terms of practice. How would one approach that today? And even there, I say I think it reflects also, historically these the Gnostic developed that, but the idea of either you engage with the text or you engage with your mind directly. So that is fine. One might be able to engage with the mind, but then there would be need of some kind of instruction given either in Abhisheka, by the Guru, or really in somehow, in some way, or symbolically, so that one is able to actually see the representation happening and then somehow disidentify. Because this whole project, as I kind of laying out, it's a project of disidentification with a false self in a certain way. First, one must be able to see. Now, we could ask, somebody who is able to see and disidentify, does he actually need to engage in all this renunciation? Could it, in external renunciation, can he not be a king in a palace? Now, this is interesting because this brings us back to a lot of Greco-Roman philosophical debates. They had the same similar question, and answers go on and off. I think Christians would emphasize more the weight, for the next world and the purity and so forth. Well, some more pagan, if you want, enjoy a good glass of wine and wants to be able to participate in family life, yet having enough detachment and wisdom not to reproduce greed at every instance, hatred and ignorance. Somehow, I think that the philosophical framework that I present speaks of that, give the training towards that. However, I emphasize something, and this part where we might disagree or not. To me, this is a very intellectual exercise I frame. They were never meant for a majority of people. They were meant for highly trained intellectuals. And back then, just like today, how many are there who can understand such exercises? So I think that reaches a very few people, and it might work for them. But then I believe that the more external, more symbolic forms of rituals are actually more accessible. And this is perhaps where later yoga gain in popularity, because they are, forgive me, popular. They are making accessible something, a culture, which call it scholasticism, that was never meant for the majority. I'm not sure about that, because this goes beyond my own scholarship, and it requires historical details that I don't have. But it's, I have the presupposition of that the Bhakti, Hatha Yoga, and so forth comes at a time where there is a diminution of the monastic orders and a desire from broader communities to engage, and the training that Madhyamika is really not easy, and Advaita in its pure scholastic form either. And I don't think Sāṃkhya even is that very accessible, actually. Although the text, perhaps in the Sanskrit form, is not so difficult. I think what it talks about, and I think actually it has been underestimated. I think it's very more complex than we imagine, and that it gives actually so complex that it gave the impulse for most of philosophy afterward. But I will leave it as that, so that maybe you want to respond, or perhaps the people in the audience want to ask questions. I hope I was able to answer most of your questions without taking too much time. Yeah.
Mikel, Jason, please respond. It would be nice to have the dialogue between you three at this time. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I wanted to say how much I appreciated your ability to respond to our various questions, Karl, because my questions were sort of merged with the general spiel that I was giving, and you were able to pick them out very discerningly. So thank you for that. I don't want to go through them all again. I mean, I don't think there's a great deal of disagreement between you and me on these points. I think, though, that one could take different perspectives on some of the matters. So, for example, when you emphasize the continuity between Vedic sacrifice and darshana, and then later sort of tantra practice and so on, I think one could just as well characterize that in terms of a sort of disruption and a rejection. But it's just, I suppose, where one puts the emphasis. Because again, thinking about my what I'm most familiar with is the Sāṃkhyakārikā of the text that you discuss. At the outset of the Sāṃkhyakārikā, there's how explicit it is a further question, but there's certainly an implicit rejection of Vedic sacrifice within the text itself, and a sort of turning away from that. That's a kind of method that can take one so far. But if one really wants to eradicate the causes of dukkha, the causes of suffering, then one has to engage in or with the kind of philosophy that Sankhya is promoting. So one could see it as a rejection, but I think, as you rightly say, one can also see it as a continuity insofar as if one construes it in terms of an internalization of a kind of sacrificial practice. So again, I don't think there's a disagreement there, but it's just how one characterizes it and where one puts the emphasis. That was one thought that occurred to me. Don't know whether Jason has any thoughts on what Karl was saying.
Well, Karl, I'm looking forward to the sequel to your book, where perhaps you look at some of the later yoga traditions of the second millennium. I think you're right that Hatha and Raja Yoga and Bhakti and so forth were intended for a broader audience, not necessarily so learned in Shastra. I mean, just the literature itself suggests that it's written in very basic Sanskrit rather than Shastric Sanskrit, and it doesn't require the sort of study that the traditions that you've looked at obviously do. So I think there are different mechanisms at work there, and perhaps it's, I suppose what I was trying to say was that, in your response and also in the book, of course you emphasize the role of studying this sort of the conventional reality that's encapsulated in lists. And you said when you were responding that at some point, whether the lists are there or not, the practitioner has to engage with their own worldview. If they're wishing to attain the ultimate reality, a higher worldview, if you like. And I suppose what I was trying to say was I have a feeling in yoga traditions the heavy lifting is done more by the yoga practice rather than by the practitioner themselves. Yes, they certainly have to deal with their mind. There are obstacles. There's the challenges of learning the practice and so forth. But at the end of the day, I think what ultimately creates the transformation is the yoga practice. And yes, and so I get the feeling that particularly as the practices became more diverse and physical yoga took off, that required very little sort of intellectual study. I get the feeling that there wasn't a lot of emphasis on the sort of Gnostic process, but certainly the Gnostic outcome was proclaimed. Was certainly said to be achievable.
So Mikel, one thing in the Sāṃkhyakārikā, the metaphor of milk I associate that with Prakriti itself, right? I mean, the text as well. And so when the text makes so much effort to recall the sacrifice, should we say that it's interested in the sacrifice in itself? I mean, if there is if the text didn't care at all about the sacrificial context, why would I have even mentioned elements of sacrifice or structured itself in a way that looks like a sacrifice? That is where I believe there is elements of continuity as a tradition that doesn't want to lose itself, but to turn within itself. That's where I play with that. Shall we perhaps, if there is a public, some of our colleagues there online want to intervene, or shall we open it to others?
Yes. So far, there hasn't been any questions submitted. So okay. If you're in the audience and you'd like to submit a question to Karl, Nick, or Jason, responses, please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A and we can come to them.
And perhaps we can use this. We can could try a question to Jason, since I don't know. But within the context of later yoga, when it comes to you say the practice itself, the yoga does the hard work. How is the hard work somehow pacifying the mind? How does it put an end to the projection, the misidentification, the misunderstanding, the mistakes? How does moving, breathing, making sound, having emotions, imagining things, how does that cut through ignorance?
Oh, it's very easy, Karl. It's just a matter of manipulating internal energies. So, by manipulating prana and apana, moving them into the central channel, it's the breath stops moving in Ida and Pingala. This is, of course, looking more at Hatha and Raja Yoga. And so then the mind stops, and also the practices burn up past karma. They burn up vasanas. So really, what the person's worldview might have been before, or what their emotional state was before, or their past, all of that is is taken care of. And I think there's an element of that in Patanjali Yoga, although of course Patanjali Yoga is embedded within a much more sophisticated philosophy, but still, I think in a lot of cases that philosophy is really only there, or the metaphysics is really only there to explain why the practices work, how the Nirodha state is achieved. And that's the same on a simpler level in later yoga traditions. They're just, as long as the practices can be mastered and the internal energy is properly manipulated, well, then the mind stops, and when the mind stops, samadhi arises. When samadhi arises, then perception of, to use, I suppose, the language of later yoga traditions, then the individual self, the Jivatman, becomes one with the Paramatman, the universal self. So yes, I think, as I said before, I think the yogic processes, if you like, create the transformation. It's not so much a Gnostic process.
Yes. I think that's quite. Thank you for clarifying it to me. See, to me, for example, it highlights. If we switch the terminology, not Gnostics, and if you want a physicalist, but it highlights that there is a return in those yoga. There is a return to a very realistic worldview. There is a return, for example, to in Jainism, karma is materialistic, right? It's the early way of conceiving, beside Kundakunda, which in my view is Gnostic, as I explained in the text and kind of challenged that. There is this idea that karma is material that gets stuck on the soul and it must be removed through tapas, right? And that's very physicalist. So somehow that worldview, as I'm trying to say, gets rejected by the Gnostic. There is a tendency to disaffirm that idea, the whole reality of that world is dissolved, in the contemplation, but in the philosophy, and it's proven, if you want, demonstrated logically, dialectically to be false, and then somehow they would argue that the work needs to be done at a much subtler level. But that's interesting that there is this shift, because at the same time where we have Gnostic philosophies, we also have other darshanas that already give that structure of philosophy that would allow for a realistic, if you want, physicalist interpretation of liberation. And they compete already before yoga. They were competing within the Madhyamika field. They were competing with Kundakunda, Advaita, and so forth, right? I mean, the Shastras are about this, if you want, often. And Shastra literature tends to reject this outright. So the doxographies I was working previously, they would classify this view at the bottom. So you would work yourself up the ladder toward the Advaitic view, for example, or the Madhyamika view, or so forth, starting with this kind of realistic view, and then slowly through abstraction. And I think that it shows just how the philosophy works as a map. It's really, so are we, are the theories true in the end? I leave it in suspension. But to make the exercise, to start with the very realistic and then to go from there to very, very abstract, if you want, burns the view, burns the world, burns whatever you're clinging to. And so in the process, that's where the therapy happens, right? In the kind of way I put it in my own word, that's how I understand this yoga. But so here it's a symbol, but in your in the traditions you work, this is not symbolic. It happens for real. The question that remains to me then, if it was real, where are they, these eternal yogis? Where are they, these people?
Oh, well, that's very easy to answer too, Karl. I mean, they're invisible because the yoga practices burn up the physical elements of the body, so it becomes like ether. So they are there in the Himalayas, and they have complete control over Prakriti. So if they want to manifest themselves for an aspirant who's ready, they can manifest themselves, pass on the teachings to the next generation. But because they're more interested in just remaining in solitude, in samadhi or whatever, they're often, yes, just there invisibly.
Swaha, that's the answer I needed. Okay.
I wonder whether there's any room for compromise or a sort of middle ground here between your view, Karl, and what Jason's been saying about the later yoga traditions, because if one were to apply this notion of lists to the Hatha Yoga material, surely one could find lists there. And if you were to look, Karl, I guess you would find some lists. You would find lists of, I don't know, nadi. Well, you find lists of practices to start with. And then maybe there's lists of nadis, lists of sounds that one hears internally as one proceeds through the practices. So it's not as though the lists are absent, but then there's the question, what role are the lists playing? And I wonder whether you could probably find, given your general approach to these things, you could probably find some pretty close analogies to the sort of function that the lists are performing in the Hatha context and in the Gnostic yoga context that you've looked at in the book. I'm not immediately sure what that role would be, but it looks as though gaining some familiarity on the part of the practitioner, or the practitioner gaining some familiarity with the structure of their internal being is going to be an important part of the practice. And yet it seems also as though that knowledge of the structure of the energy structure, the various channels and energy centers and so on, is itself provisional, because once one has gained the state of invisibility and release, then the structure can be dispensed with. So it's not immediately clear to me that there's a sharp sort of differentiation here between, say, I don't know, the kind of framework that one gets in the Hatha Pradipika on the one hand, and the kind of framework that one gets in the Sāṃkhyakārikā on the other. I mean, the frameworks are very different, but the idea of there being a sort of conception of the sort of thing that one is, and how and what that's what the materials that construct that are, and how one needs to progress in order to overcome the limitations of that structure. It looks as though there's an analogy there, I reckon.
You are hinting at least in the alchemical metaphor, where Jason and I are two extremes of the same, right? So there's a piano in between, and there are different notes. Actually, just one thing, but I quoted a passage from somebody who has worked on doxography of Tantra. It was in the second portion of the book, but he hints at a classification of those practices in two lists, and they go from from external to internal. Right? I mean, that's a movement that he suggests. This is beyond my field, but I thought it was very rich to find that. That's why I've included it in the book. It's also in the article for the Joyce. But to me, that seems to suggest what you were hinting at. Yeah.
Yes, I think maybe the middle ground is some of the earlier tantric systems of yoga, where they have a very complex yogic body and much more complex ideas around how the yoga works. I'm really referring to what's sometimes called subitous systems that sort of bypass a lot of that complexity to focus on a fairly straightforward practice. And the lists that we get in the Hatha Pradipika are mainly lists of techniques. So yes, with very little, a very simple yogic body. So I suppose I am, I'm not being deliberately provocative, but I was providing a contrast intentionally, and I think you would find within tantric yoga a much, just in the Malini Vijayuttara Tantra, for example, there's incredible sophistication of the metaphysics and theory around that yogic practice. So so maybe that's the middle ground.
On these list of practices that you are talking about, Jason, one identifies with one's practice, right? These lists, they kind of serve to say, I am at this level, or I am at this level, or I practice this kind of thing for a certain time, right? There's a certain identification with in Buddhism would be a bhumi, but with a certain level of practice, right? Am I correct?
There are stages of yoga that so in the fourth chapter of the Hatha Pradipika, there are 4 stages of yoga that the yogi progresses through, and as Mick mentioned, different sounds arise, different levels of bliss, different graded levels of empty, void-like meditative states arise. And in other texts, there's also 4 types of yogi, and depending on the qualities of the student, they get a particular sort of practice. I don't know if that's, but I'd say that's probably determined by the guru rather than the practitioner. The guru assesses the student and then decides what type of yoga they're supposed to do. But yes, with the lists and the types of student, the stages of yoga, and things like that. As I say, with the stages of yoga, I see it more as descriptive. Going through the signposts that the practitioner may see as they're practicing to sort of ensure that they're on the right path, and that they're headed towards the final stage, which is nishpati, perfecting the perfection stage, the stage of completion. So again, I see it more as descriptive.
I wanted to offer the question. I'm engaging with you in a kind of Socratic manner. Actually, the reason I was asking is that if we take this idea of the list and then we identify which stages. Now let's take a text like the Sāṃkhyakārikā, which I love because it looks simple, so we can understand it. It has 25 stages and so forth. And to me, it offers not only the creation of the world, but most importantly, its dissolution. And I think the actual practice is related to the dissolution. And so going backward to Purusha, somehow, there is the list of 24 category, and one somehow identifies in its practice at every level. So the initial student starts with, contemplating the Mahabhutas or something very close to him. Like if you go today to a kind of insight meditation or somewhere, you contemplate your breath or your big toe or an organ of your body, and then you move from there to ever more abstract. And I think somehow, you see, if you wanted to look something like carries on, if you want, what Mikel was talking about. In the Sāṃkhyakārikā, we see there is a movement of identification from a state where it's perhaps more accessible, right? The immediate thing, to very abstract. Buddhi is ultimately abstract, right? The Ahamkara is already quite abstract. The doxographies, they do that too. So we start with levels that are more accessible in terms of philosophy to ever more abstract. And when the time comes, in later text to classify practices, either tantric or perhaps yogic, I believe that it would also move like this, because it is just, to me, it's pure pedagogy. We have to go like this. We have to start with where the student is. So the text, structures itself in a way that, well, let's start with the easiest, and then we'll make it more and more complex. In philosophy, the easiest is, if you want the easiest to explain, we have to go to ever more abstract thought. But for there, we need to put down concepts that are immediately relatable. But I feel that this movement from the abstract to from the gross to the abstract, continues, and I've seen this in so many kinds of literature and so many traditions that, to me, it comes to mean yoga. This, if you want, dissolution, yoga as training proper to move out at least of one's way and to dissolve at least one's obstacle. But anyway, I propose that as a metaphor, but it just carries through, right? Yeah. I think we took a lot of time. We still have a public, which is amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if no one from the audience is desperate to ask questions, I could respond to what you were saying about the Sāṃkhyakārikā there. Because it sounds right to me that that what's being sort of traced out within the text, the Sāṃkhyakārikā, is a sort of trajectory from what is often said to be the gross to the more subtle, the increasingly subtle, and so the way that you put it sounds right, Karl. But I think one thing that continues to puzzle me is, I suppose, I could put it in relation to something that you say about the Sāṃkhyakārikā in the book, which I think at one point you say something to the effect that the Sāṃkhyakārikā is itself a kind of ritual practice. Does that sound like something you say? Yeah. And that, I suppose, that puzzled me a little. So there's a overarching question here that relates, in my mind, particularly to the Sāṃkhyakārikā, but I think it probably has more general application, which is the relation between the text and the practice. Because on my reading of the Sāṃkhyakārikā, it looks as though there's very little, if anything, in the way of practical instruction about what to do with this this kind of theoretical material, this conceptual framework that's being provided. What do you do with it? But the way that you put it in the book implies that it's somehow there. Just reading the text is itself a kind of spiritual practice or a soteriological practice, and that I couldn't quite see that. I thought, well, if one somehow relates the the conceptual framework that's provided in the Sāṃkhyakārikā to a form of meditative practice in which one is endeavoring to discern these various tattvas, these various sort of elements of our being within one's conscious state. So one reduces one's mental activity to a minimum, and then one is able to discern the different levels, the different layers of the various factors that have to be there in place in order for experience to arise. Then I can see how the Sāṃkhyakārikā forms a component of a practice. But how does the Sāṃkhyakārikā itself constitute a practice, as you put it?
Okay, but I think the text itself, I mean, the way I put it in the book tries to show how it could work, right? That's why I propose this exercise. Let's imagine it's a ritual that mirrors the Shraddha rituals, right? And then I say we don't even have to change the text. We can have these 4 rhythms. But here, I think there's one problem, is that it's a late text, right? So we have a tradition of list making, and then we have one only surviving example, more or less, that is a fixated list, and it has to present itself in some kind of a Shastra manner. So it has to have an introduction and a form, to develop itself. So I think the text could have, if I was to write it and wanted to produce the same exercise, most likely I would follow another kind of structure. But by itself, I think the text invites us, at least in 2 main movements. And that first movement is it invites us to see how the world comes to be. And that's interesting because the pedagogy we would expect is to go from the gross to the subtle, but the text goes the opposite way. The actual text goes from the subtle to the gross, right? And this is where, it goes with my theory, if you want, that there are 2 movements in Gnostic Yoga. There are 2 stages. One is to produce the world, the other one is to negate it. Right, so that's, and I go with the Jñāna and so forth. Okay, so and somehow the text produces the world and gives you the reason how it comes to be. There is very little said about Purusha. There's not much one can say about Purusha besides it's the opposite. That, to me, in itself, it serves its purpose. It's a negation. We don't need to talk about it too much. We just have to have the layer out. So we have this progression from the tattvas and then the bhavas, and then we have this final section, which I call the yupa, the sacrificial zone, which tells us actually what is happening here, which invites us to make the movement backward. So I think that a careful study, if one was to want to engage with that text in terms of how one, I don't know how familiar all of us are with monastic studies and so forth, but if you want engage with the text like this, with the concept, you put them in place and slowly you start to see them appearing, and you see that movement, how the cosmos is created, and then you're told at some point, well, actually now that you know how it comes to be, now you know why you're trapped and how the trap happens, now you have to make the journey back. That is where the negation happened. This, I am not this is not mine, this is not me, somehow invites us to follow. And this again is interesting because that we call the Upanishad. Right? It draws us, just that negation draws us back to the negation of the Upanishad, which draws us back to the sacrifice. Right? So again, it's another hint that the sacrificial metaphor is there. But to me, the text is a ritual exactly because it does, that's why I love that text. It's simple, it's raw, but it gives us exactly how a scholastic ritual should be, of producing the image, right? And then somehow removing it, and telling you, see what happens. And then you keep repeating this until you have a question, then about this particular point in the text, you don't know this particular appearance of the cosmos, you can go back to that verse, it tells you. But the important is the movement of the creation itself, so that you know what you're going to negate. Because you cannot reflect directly Purusha. You can just somehow, Prakriti can just mirror what she is not. So you have to see her first. And it's very interesting because if you look, there's a commentary, that's why I quoted there, but there's a commentary on in the Bodhicharyavatara, a Buddhist text from a Tibetan, and it talks about how negation works. And it tells you somehow at the negation, you must first know what is to be negated before before you can proceed with the negation. You cannot just engage with emptiness. You have to know emptiness of something, emptiness of what, and you first establish this. And this is also, and if you think, this is also tantric. It is what I mean. This is engaging with poison, right? Actually, the Sāṃkhyakārikā talks about poison. It gives you the structure of alienation, which you must remove. So in that way, if you want the short, it's a long answer, I know, but there is this process from very subtle to grow, so that we see how the image is generated, and then it invites you to dissolve that image. The thing is that it's not necessarily explicit. I think it's poetic.
Yeah.
Inside, I insisted on that in my reading, and that is not from me immediately. That's from Larson, who actually suggested without insisting too much. But I think it is a poem, and more than a poem, it's an allegory. Very, very beautifully woven. And the text finishes and tells us that the list, if you want, was there a long time ago, but the novelty are the allegories. So actually, Īśvarakṛṣṇa's genius is to turn these lists into a poem. A very beautiful poem that creates the world and invites you to dissolve it and see in yourself how your thoughts, your worldview, and everything has followed in that manner.
Thanks. That all makes sense to me. But I think you included within what you were saying there the idea that this would need to be understood within did you say a sort of monastic context? I think you used the term monastic, but anyway, within a context where you're able to be instructed on which practices to undergo in order to carry out this process of sort of involution. It might be put in terms of a sort of evolutionary movement outwards, as you were calling it, the creation of the world, and then an involutionary movement inwards and a dissolution. I think the only point I'd make is that the text on its own is not self-sufficient. It requires this practical context in which one is receiving the instruction. Would you agree with that?
Yes, and also I would say that's perhaps the weakness of my work in terms of philology, because it's not written in the commentary and it's not written in the text, that one has to read it that way. Right. Most likely because it was understood that way, you didn't have to write it down. So it was communicated, as I had the chance, if you want personally, to study not that text, but to study text in monastic context. And the instruction there are not necessarily how to put your fingers on your nose or what movement to do to breathe and so forth, but they are how to conceive certain categories. What is the meaning of that word? What word refers to what and so forth. So it's scholastic training. Actually, monastic training is scholastic training. Kind of goes hand in hand in that sense. And yes, I believe that text was embedded in the culture.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all very much. I think we're right on time now, so we might call it an end. Karl, thank you so much for presenting your book and allowing both Mikel and Jason to not only read a preview copy, but also to engage with the material so intellectually, so that we could actually have this stimulating conversation. I did have one question for you, Karl. I know we're about to finish, but the idea of the word therapy and whether it relates less to yoga and more to cognitive therapies that are sort of abounding at the moment as a alternative. I just wondered whether you wanted to speak on the word therapy at all before we finish.
Okay, well, thank you. First, also, thank you, Jackie, for having allowed this. I owe you immense gratitude because I came to you and I asked, and then I'm very, very grateful that we could have this conversation. It's meaningful, both of you, Mikel and Jason, to have you, and Jackie as well. Now, therapy, it's a new dada of me for the last 2-3 years. Also, it emerged in my work, I would say in perhaps in the last 5 years. There was this ancient sect, the therapeutics, I'm a fan of classic, all right? I'm basically classicist by formation, Greco-Roman. So the word to me resonate within that context. But you talk about something more recent. I'm not a big fan of the necessarily just a cognitive, logical therapy and so forth. But there is a new development in in philosophy that aims to bring back, if you want, philosophy to the Socratic principle of the examined life, where the texts are pointers, they are supporters, they support a kind of reflection, but they not necessarily in themselves answer questions, and that in that exercise of rationality, of intellect, one can, if you want, work on problems that we have that are not necessarily, and I'm talking in modern context, that are not necessarily, how we call that, looking for a word here, but pathological, right? We have a lot of issues, but not all our problems are pathological, right? If you go see a psychologist or a therapist, most likely your problem is going to be pathologized in some kind of way. You're going to deal with yourself through a kind of medical framework that going to drive you towards some medicine or this and that, so chemistry. And the idea of therapy and philosophy is that there's a lot of problems that we create through thinking in a troublesome manner. We have cognitive dissonance. We have different ways of reading the world that actually doesn't match not only reality but even common sense in some way, and it's different. So basically, there are a whole range of problems which we face, which do not require a medical outlook, but they require a kind of philosophical treatment. They require one to train the mind to think. So the idea of philosophy of therapy, and also why I mentioned metaphysics as therapy, is to revalue that process. To actually, I think it's a birthright. We are all born with a very, very precious mind, which we can train. And there's a lot of problems which we face, which we can undo. And finally, if playing piano or doing sport does the thing, or yoga in its physical iteration, does that. But philosophy too, and it works. Actually, there are studies that shows that there's more, research that needs to be done in that area. But so, yeah, in a long story short, the idea here of metaphysics, of philosophy as therapy, is to use, thinking as the groundwork for, to avoid words like transformation and so forth, the groundwork for solving very immediate problems. That are, we have so many problems, not just as individuals, but as society. Yeah. So it's also, so if you want, trying to bring the light back on one dimension of philosophy that we have forgotten, unfortunately. And that's, that could play an important social role, I believe. And that's perhaps where, Nick, at the end of the book, I come with a more reflection on what about the practice here. I try to acknowledge that well, if we were to try to engage in some kind of a Gnostic practice, how would it look like? What would be the challenges and so forth? Because I actually do, it's not just a belief, I know that philosophy changes people, transforms people, and I just personally, it has changed my life. But you don't, cannot speak like this. So we shouldn't do that, I guess, as researchers. But anyway, so that's the idea behind it, Jackie. Thank you for asking. I think that's a very relevant part of the book, actually. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you again, Karl. And I'm sure we will have continued these conversations at another time when we meet up again. But once again, I'd like to thank our guests, so Mikel Burley, Jason Birch, and Karl, yourself, and thank everyone for attending the lecture series that's happened throughout the term. And we'll probably be back in September for the continuation of the SOAS Centre of Yoga Studies lecture series. So thank you once again, and we look forward to seeing you in the coming year. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.